everyone. Happy Top 5 Friday from Long Arming by Jacqueline. Today we're going to talk about my top tips for ensuring that your quilt finish is the prettiest quilt finish that you can have. And these are not hard, fast rules. Like anything, I'm sure there's people out there who have broken my rules and come out with absolutely beautiful results. But these are my tips these are sort of consistent, reliable ways to ensure that you're gonna be come up with something that you're happy with and things to think about when you're designing your quilt. So first we got to talk a little bit about value, and this is a word that I use a lot, but it's not one that you hear in day-to-day life a lot. So value is how dark something looks in a black and white picture. So I have got two threads here, a black and a white, and these have as different a value as you can get, the deepest value and the lightest value, so high contrast. These two threads, this gray and this avocado, this is actually coin and avocado, are very different colors, but same value, or very similar value. So that little vocabulary lesson, all that to say, for the most reliably consistent, beautiful quilt results, you want a similar value, sort of the average value of the top of your quilt and the value of the back of your quilt. And that's going to play into several things. First of all, if you have a lot of white on the front, and you have a very dark back, you will get some show through, possibly. And there are some things you can do to block that, but it's going to make your quilt heavier. So sort of standard quilt as they're normally made, if you have an extreme difference in value to the front and the back, you will possibly see through a little bit. And also, if you have any issues with color bleeding, the stronger the value difference, the more you're going to notice bleed through of actual like dye migrating around in the washing machine or something like that. The other reason that it's important to have a similar value from the front to the back to give you those beautiful finished quilt results is because you do want to use a similar value thread to the front and the back. So we're talking the needle thread on the top and the bobbin thread on the bottom. Ideally, we'll have a similar value. If your fabrics are wildly different, there's no way to choose a value that's going to work on the top and work on the bottom and also work with each other. The reason for that is your needle thread comes down, scoops around the bobbin thread, and you actually have a loop like this, which ideally, when tension is perfect, is buried in the center of your quilt, and you don't see it as much. But you do see a little bit of that bobbin color on the top, and you do see a little bit of that top needle thread on the back. And so it looks like a shadow or a tinge. So if you have extreme differences, then that shadow is going to be more noticeable, and you can sort of think of one color being polluted by another color. So if you think you're going to have this like pristine bleached white, perfectly snow white whole cloth top and a black back of your quilt, and you think you're not going to see any of this bobbin thread on the top, you will. You're not going to see pure white, this color on the top. You're going to see a mixture of the two. And depending on what the machine is doing, there will be areas where there's a little bit more or less of that dilution of one color blending into the other color. So if there's similar value, that is much more camouflage. You're not going to notice it, and even if you do, it's not going to bother you because it's all going to work together. If your top and your back are so far apart in color story or in darkness that the thread that works for one will not work for the other, then you're going to be a little bit more unhappy with the bleed through of bobbin and top thread onto the opposite side of the quilt. So if you go similar, then you never have to worry about that issue. Number 3, bind with strips. I know people love a rolled binding, and I've done rolled binding videos on my channel, and it's a great technique if you want to go fast. It's not as durable, and a traditional strip binding, it hides a multitude of sins. A lot of quilting designs don't look great at the edge. So you have to have some kind of a way to come to a close. You have to have somewhere to tie off your threads. You have to have somewhere to do tension checks. And that edge space is kind of where that happens most easily, most readily for a quilter. And then if you can sort of trim away the less than ideal part on the edge and then put a fresh binding on there, that is going to beautify your quilt quite a bit and then give you a much more sort of neat and durable finish than a single layer rolled binding. So you're going to have to terminate that quilting design some kind of way, but you also need a margin so you can pull back and trim, pull back your backing out of the way and trim your other two layers. So it limits the pretty ways that you can end a quilting design, and you have to come up with some way to sort of hide or camouflage or make that termination of the design look a little bit more intentional and purposeful. And there's a lot of things that you kind of just can't do because there's no way to hide the sort of where it runs off the page in a normal quilt where you're going to trim the whole thing and add strips. And it just gives, in my opinion, a much neater finish. And if you flip it over and you see where the quilting ends on the back, it's not necessarily going to combine well with that straight long seam of top stitching that closes your rolled binding. And I just think it gives you more flexibility, more beautiful options, and more consistently good results to use separate strips for your binding and bind with strips instead of rolling the back over. Or you could potentially also roll the front over, but typically it's the backing that gets rolled to the front. Also, that gives you another design element. You can add a contrasting frame, you can add a punch of color, you can sort of play with textures there. There's a lot of fun things where that edge can be an addition to your quilt design instead of just being stuck using one side or the other, and it is what it is. Press and clip threads as you go. I'm sure we all have good intentions and we think, oh, I don't have time to do this now. I'll do this at the end. If you don't have time to clip your threads and press your seams as you go, you're not going to want to face that sort of monolithic job of doing all of that at the end. So clip, 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 whether it's fray off of the edges of your blocks, whether it's the tails of where you finished sewing, clip, 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 press, press, press. The neater and flatter that it is at each stage, the more that sort of neatness and flatness is going to build off of each other. It's going to be a neater, flatter subunit is a better base for a neater, flatter block. Neater, flatter blocks make neater, flatter tops. Neater, flatter tops make neater, flatter quilts. So keeping it neat, keeping it flat, keeping it trimmed and pressed as you go is a big, important one for making your results consistently and reliably more beautiful, more lovely finishes. Next one, pre-washing. This is a hot ticket item. I know they're very opinionated about pre-washing. My opinion is if you pre-wash, you're going to do that at the yardage stage or not at all. Once you have cut into fabric and you've lost the stability of the selvage, I do not recommend watching because of the agitation. And you're going to have uneven shrinkage. So if you have done some cutting, whatever cutting you've done is no longer sort of applicable because the size will have changed. So before you start, or not at all, is my opinion. Other people do things differently. If you're sort of rough cutting and then you're going to come back and do your precision cutting later and sort of double your work, that could potentially be an option, but my recommendation is like buy your fabric, pre-wash it, put it up, come up with your project later, or wash your finished quilt top. Wash your finished quilt. All right, and then on that note, stabilize your unfinished quilt tops and blocks. If they're going to be stored, if they're going to be handled. If your sewing space is not a dedicated sewing space, you sew at your dining room table and you have to pick all that up and carry it away, and serve dinner to your family and then pull it all out the next day. And there's a lot of that back and forth. You're going to be doing a lot more handling of your blocks and your unfinished units than if someone has a dedicated space, and when I'm not sewing, my stuff sits here, and when I come back, it's exactly where I left it. No one has touched it. So any unfinished quilt units, whether it's cut triangles and squares, whether it's semi-finished blocks, whether it's semi-finished tops, you want to stabilize those. So if you do have to wash fabric that has been cut, or partially finished quilt tops or blocks or whatever it is, you want to stabilize that. And the easiest way to do that is to stay stitch, which means reduce your presser foot pressure, pushing down. Use a walking foot or a steady feed, which is what my Juki has. It's equivalent to a walking foot. It's just built in to the machine. And you will gently sew close to the edge all the way around. So if you use a 1/4 inch seam allowance, normally when you're quilting, you want your stay stitching to be a little bit shy of a 1/4 inch, so that it's as close to where your seam is going to fall as you can kind of get without being on top of the seam or visible once you put that seam in. So just into the seam allowance of whatever seam allowance you're going to use. And that is probably the ideal, like a 3/16, if your sewing can be that accurate. And you'll go all the way around and stabilize, because the thread is not going to stretch. This is not going anywhere. So that is going to prevent what people call bias stretch, is really bias warp. That is really the fibers of your fabric fanning apart. They're losing the friction between the yarns of the fabric, and they're not stretching. Stretching implies like elastic. It's gonna get longer and come back to size, and there's a spring to that, like a piece of elastic. Your fabric is not elastic, so when it stretches, it's not stretching, it's warping. You're losing friction between those fibers, and they fan apart and they don't come back. So that's why it's no longer flat and it has that sort of bacon, because it's shorter here and longer here, and it's got to crinkle somewhere to take up that difference between what used to be the same width is now like this. And the last one, to ensure that you have the most reliably beautiful results, you want to make sure that your backing is 4 to 6 inches bigger than your top all the way around. I would say for the batting, like more like 2 to 4 inches is probably sufficient around. So if you have an 80-inch long quilt and you want, say, 6 inches on the top and 6 inches on the bottom, that means you need a 92-inch long. So 80 plus 6 and 6 is 12, is 92-inch long backing piece to go with that. And if it's 100 inches wide, you would want a 112 inches wide piece of backing to accommodate that top. That has to do with whether you are using a sit-down machine, sending it to a longarmer, whatever it is, you need handles to grab that quilt during the quilting process. So whether it's really your hands that are handling it, or whether it's attached into the frame of the long arm, you need room. And you need the sewing machine to be able to get over toward the edge without being impeded by the edge of that fabric, by running out of something to hold onto or hitting your clamps. Those are not things you really want to happen. So I used to say 4 inches all around, and I really think 6 is better. So you're going to end up with some compromises if you short your long armor on your backing. They will do their best, but they're going to have to do some sort of dancing around and compromising. One thing is those attachment points always are going to have like a little bit of a beak where they actually attach. And the further you are from the point that tension is actually applied, to your quilt, the less that beak is going to show up in your quilt. So if you're quilting right up to where that where that clamp is pulling, you're going to have a little bit of a beak where those fibers have been pulled just a little bit, and you want that a little bit of margin, a little bit of space away from the fabric that's actually going to stay and live in your quilt. So really important. And if you have a nice design that looks beautiful and makes your border beautiful, but you're sort of cramped because you're trying not to get the machine working too close to those clamps, then it makes you sort of tentative and like you can't go over there. So sometimes the designs aren't as smooth because you're trying to like flinch away from that point where you hit the clamp. So you don't want any of that. Give your longarmer plenty of room, give yourself plenty of room if you're gonna do it on your domestic machine at home, and then just trim it off and use it for something else. That fabric doesn't go away. There's nothing wrong with it. Trim it off, use it for something else. Everyone does small projects. You might just need that color for a little stem on your English paper piecing or a little applique unit, and it might be the perfect thing. So don't be afraid to make it a little bit. Don't try to go down to the thread of how much you think you need. You need more than you think you need. So make sure that there's plenty of fabric. I would rather cut it off and give it back to you than be like flinching away from that clamp on the side. So that's it. Think about value. Begin with the end in mind. Your top of your quilt and your back of your quilt are going to have to match your binding. So choose your front and your back with binding in mind. Do your best to have a neat, flat, stable quilt. And the more you do that along every step of the way, the more reliably you're going to end up with that at the end of your journey. It can be a long road for some of us. My first quilt took me months to finish, and there was a lot of in and out because it was in my bedroom. So I had to pack it away and pull it out, and pack it away and pull it out. There was a lot of handling going on with that. Give yourself plenty of fabric, whether you're quilting it yourself or you're sending it off to be quilted. And that's really it. And if you come up with a beautiful quilt that breaks all my rules, then fantastic, because these are my suggestions, these are my opinion. I find these reliable. I find these generally to be good ideas. I'm not saying if you don't follow these rules, it's going to be a disaster, but this is how I lean into good results with the small things that I do every day. All right, thanks. All right, happy Top 5 Friday. Enjoy your sewing. Have a good day. Bye.